welcome to a new edition of Underground Strategy. We have the great pleasure of having Professor Peter Caddick-Adams with us today, an eminent historian, an author, professor, and also a former army officer. Today we'll be talking a little bit about his latest book, Winston Churchill, as part of the Prime Minister series, and of course his vast experiences also inside and outside of the military. And we will unashamedly be discussing all of Churchill's famous quotes and experiences. So welcome, Peter. Lovely to have you with us. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Delighted. Would you like me to do it in a Churchillian voice? I can easily arrange. First, I'll put on my very undapper siren suit, which is what Churchill designed to wear in the war rather than proper suit. But there we are. I was very fortunate to work at the Defence Academy in the United Kingdom for 20 years. And for most of that time, my boss, friend, patron, mentor was a wonderful guy, military historian, head of the UK Reserve Forces, as well as my professor, called Richard Holmes, who some of your listeners will know wrote 30, 40 books on different aspects of military history. And we got on incredibly well. And in 2003, I went to him and said, I'm a reserve officer, as you know, and I'd like to go off to Iraq because the war is pending. And he looked at me and he said, well, I'm head of the reserve forces. I'm a brigadier, so I'm very pleased with that. But I'm also your professor and I'm rather nervous about losing you. I will have to go away and have lunch and have a good discussion with myself about what to do. And he came back after lunch and he said, you'll be pleased to know the brigadier won and the professor caved in, so you can go. That's the kind of man he was.
I mean, he clearly needed good counsel and he received it.
Well, he was a wonderful inspirational figure. So I tip my hat to him every day because he taught me a lot of what I know about the craft of writing and working with archives. And also the fact being a successful military historian involves a degree of credibility in having worn uniform and been, in my case, to war zones. It's time and chance. You know, in the Cold War, most historians wouldn't have been exposed to the sort of opportunities that I've had. But it does mean that it gives you an extra perspective on how little you know when you're up at the front about really what's going on, and making sense that historians do later on. It's just not something you can do at that time. It's incredibly mysterious, and trying to piece together fragmented reports from excited soldiers is just incredibly challenging, especially when if you're with a NATO coalition or, you know, the coalitions that we fight with nowadays of up to 30 different nations. When people get excited, they tend to revert to their own language or talk to you in what they think is English. So you not only have to work out what's going on, but you also have to decipher what they say or they think they're saying, which is another added challenge, because I was in both Iraq and Bosnia as the official NATO historian. So that gave me a degree of access to all the different nations. So it was a great privilege to have done that. And that's really informed my writing as well.
Peter, that is an incredible journey. I mean, working with Richard Holmes, who was such a key figure in military history, and serving as NATO historian, that is very impressive. And that is also the kind of experience that really puts your writing into perspective. I read one of your recent pieces in The Critic where you quoted Churchill saying, writing a book is an adventure. To begin with, it's a toy and an amusement. Then it becomes a mistress, then a master, and then a tyrant. Did that mirror your own experience with writing?
100% it does, because when I had a launch party for the first book I wrote, the second book I wrote, which is a dual biography of Montgomery and Rommel and their parallel lives, we launched it in a London restaurant. I stood up, and that's exactly the quote I made about how wonderful and then challenging and then despairing writing a book can be. But the thing I enjoy most about it is the craft of writing as well as the research. And you mentioned The Critic, and I try and write a piece for The Critic every week. And that's as much to flex the writing muscle. So if I was just writing books, I'd have long periods of research, of doing no writing, and then an incredibly fast and furious session of pounding out the chapters. But because I deal with current affairs as much as history, and also other things as well, so I do past, present, and future, as I say. What I like to do is make sure I write every day. And that's a word of advice to anyone who's listening, who's an aspiring or established writer. Keep that writing muscle going. So I try and pump out between 1,000 and 2,000 words every single day that are publishable, even if it's in sort of note forms and research, but everything. So it means that the craft of writing is much, much easier when you come to do a big book. You're quite sure in your own mind where you're going, what you're going to say, and the words come much easier.
Thanks for that, Peter. And I think we will definitely take that bit of advice. It's very practical and does make sense. And I mean, we are, of course, nowhere near that standard, but of course, it's something to aspire to. On the earlier point, Peter, you had mentioned about your role as an official historian with NATO and some of the war zones you had visited. And the way you explained that is just a tremendous role as an official historian, in Sarajevo, also in the Gulf. And I know there are many jealous listeners out there who's hearing about that now, for those that didn't know. And you had mentioned how it had informed a lot of your practice being there on the front line in terms of your research. And it kind of answers the question that I was planning to ask, but I'm going to flip it a little bit now and just say, would you also see it in a way like when you're in active operations that you kind of have that long discussion, that long perspective of history in your mind as a tool? So when you're seeing certain things, you can kind of play it back or look at different situations that may have chimed. Or is there anything like that happening, when you go into those active combat areas?
Totally. I believe in the bigger wheels of history. So things may not repeat on a day-to-day basis. But if you look back over, say, a century, you can see various themes being repeated. And at the moment, we might say that we are sacking the international rules-based order that has governed international crises and wars for the last century. And we're going back to earlier times of spheres of influence, which is what President Trump has actively sort of said he wants to do with the Russians and the Chinese. So that would be an example of sort of some of the bigger wheels of history. And certainly if you look for them, they're there. I don't think history ever quite repeats, but it's helpful. And so being a sort of qualified historian on the staff, I had the senior commanders would come and consult with me. And we'd have long conversations about where we thought campaigns were going as they were being fought. So I was able to give them sort of insight from my purely academic point of view. And they were the professionals fighting the war. But I like to feel I contributed in some way. I mean, if I give you an example, in Iraq, there was a great fear that the Americans were pushing the British contingent into bombing targets that didn't need bombing. And I said, well, this is not the first time we fought alongside the Americans in a coalition. And even in the Second World War, it was a coalition, even though the Americans were much larger, but it was still a coalition of equals. And this was nothing like the British being the lapdogs of the Americans, which was the accusation at the time, and it is the accusation often today. We're more like a sheepdog that shepherds the Americans in the right direction because we've got more experience of world wars and colonial wars than they had certainly then, and possibly arguably even now. So we give them the benefit of our advice and our experience in the most diplomatic of ways. And we like to think that influences their decision making. So that's an example of, experience being brought to bear in the sort of bigger wheels of history. And I think that's still relevant, even in today's frame of mind.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And as we tend to think that history is just something to be studied, but like you said, it is about recognizing patterns and making better decisions. And too often people ignore those lessons and repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. And that's why having historians who have actually been out there, who have seen it firsthand and that have worked in war zones, it makes a huge difference. Because then it's not just theory, it's experience that connects the past to the present.
Yeah, I've never done history for its own sake. I've always wanted the pull through, as it were, to contemporary events. So one of the ways I write my military histories is always to rely on what I call earthen archives. So I'm looking at the physical paperwork that was kept as a record, which of course I've done in recent campaigns. Then I do all oral history interviews, and I've probably interviewed a couple of thousand veterans from the Second World War because I've been doing this for a long time. But I've also made a point of walking the battlefield terrain, and it's surprising how many historians have never visited the battlefields that they're writing about. And that's incredibly important. And if you find yourself striding over any battlefield, but you look at it with a soldier's eye, I think that's what I'm basically trying to communicate on paper all the time. And that makes a big difference. So those battlefield sort of terrain walks, battlefield tours, are quite often with military units, whether they're from the British Army or whether they're from NATO. And that helps very much because we do a trade. I give them the historical knowledge and they bring me up to date with contemporary doctrine. So it's a great fusion of ideas. And I come back the richer every time because I learned something new about a battlefield I thought I knew. And they're developing their own insights into modern and past warfare as well. And the training ground is a real battlefield where people fought and died. And the great takeaway, I think, for all of them is to know that not that history repeats itself, but if you find yourself in a tight corner when everything sort of seems overwhelming and you're staring defeat, you know in the past that a leader found a solution and they got out of it and they either escaped or achieved a victory in the face of overwhelming odds. And you can say that's, true of the Battle of Britain. You can sort of say that there are numerous naval engagements that show that, and plenty of famous battles against overwhelming odds that show that that's the case. So if you can tell every current and future leader that in the future, if they find themselves in a spot, there are plenty of people who've got out of even worse situations. And the last thing you need to do is give up. And the best thing you can do is remember that eccentric historian you met on a battlefield tour once who told you that there's a way of getting out of this.
That is indeed a really powerful way to look at it. That history isn't just about the past. It is about leaders finding solutions when the odds are stacked against them. And I think Churchill is a perfect example of just that. And in your latest book, you really highlight the scale of his career. I mean, here's a man who rode in a cavalry charge and later commanded a nation with nuclear weapons. Could you walk us through that journey a bit and reflect on the sheer span of his life? Because it was such a dynamic period to live through.
I think Churchill was incredibly lucky that he was born when he was in 1874, and he enjoyed such a long life. Had he been born later or earlier, I don't think he would have risen to the sort of prominence that he would have done. And the fact he served so many different monarchs, he was in a position of responsibility through 2 world wars, is entirely due to the sort of year of his birth and the ability to project himself into a position of power. Had he been a much younger man, he would have ended up in the trenches of the First World War, probably wouldn't have had time to become a politician, and would probably, in all honesty, have died. Had he been slightly older, he'd have had a major role in the First World War, but might have been too old, really, to play his part in the Second World War. Let's not forget, in 1940, he's already in his 65th year, so he would have already, in theory, retired and been entitled to his retiree's free bus pass and all that goes with it. So 1874 is that incredibly important year, and either side of that, we wouldn't have had the Winston Churchill who's gone down in history in the way that he has. So there's a huge element of luck. There's also the fact that he had this two incredibly famous ancestors, one the Duke of Marlborough, whose genes I think he inherited in terms of statesmanship, but also his father, who was a brilliant politician who he sought to emulate. But there's a third gene at work. And it's not fair because he had this gene that was immune to alcohol. And if you read, even when he goes to the Boer War in 1900, he's accompanied by several cases of whiskey, cognac, champagne on active service as a very young man. And he can't function without alcohol. Paul Roger, which was his famous, most favorite brand of champagne, later calculated that he had drunk something like 40,000 bottles in his lifetime, to the extent that they even reserved a special year for him. No one could drink out. They put aside another one for him. And then they put aside a third one for him. And he returned the favor by naming one of his racehorses in the 90s, Paul Roger. And when he died in 1965, Paul Roger bordered all their bottles with a black mourning band. The ties between the two were extensive. But every day he had a pint of champagne in a special silver tankard that was kept in a little leather case that went with him everywhere for lunch. You and I, if we had a pint of champagne for lunch, I think it would floor me for the rest of the day. But he just seemed to have this immunity to alcohol. He started his day in bed doing all his paperwork until lunchtime with watered down whiskey all through the morning. His workload was prodigious, so I'm not trying to suggest that he was lazy in any way at all. His output would put us to shame. He was not only the highest paid journalist but in the world in his day, but he also produced 30 plus books that would put most of us to shame. That's before he's a member of Parliament, statesman, and all the other things he did, from sort of taking flying lessons to bricklaying, never mind painting over 500 canvases, which are, extremely good. So the alcohol seemed to stimulate him, whereas most people either get very aggressive from it or go to sleep. I'm one of the ones who goes to sleep, so I can't write and drink at the same time. But Churchill just seems to be completely immune and, in fact, functions on alcohol.
That's such an interesting point. And for our listeners, would you give us the famous line or some sort of paraphrasing of that line about Churchill and alcohol?
Churchill is famous for his one-liners and was an incredibly quick wit. And there's several phrases about alcohol that spring to mind. But one of them was that, I've taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me. He used to have he traveled everywhere with an entourage that he built up in the Second World War, including a very bright, talented Oxford professor, Prof. Lindemann, who later became Lord Cherwell. And Churchill had this really inquiring mind. So one time when they were going to visit a D-Day unit, a unit about to land on the Normandy beaches by train, he got Lindemann to calculate how many bottles of champagne could fit into the railway carriage in which they were sitting. You never had silence with Churchill, and his brain was always working on all sorts of different things. But often they were light-hearted and amusing, and he just came up with these interesting puzzles and conundrums and literary puzzles that kept everyone around him amused all the time.
Enjoying the episode? Leave a review wherever you listen. YouTube, hit subscribe to keep us going. Let's carry on.
No, that's fascinating. It just speaks to the man. And one thing that strikes me, from reading about it was that I just want to count from the First World War, which you touched on, and before he had lost his place, and then in terms of the high echelons of Parliament, goes to the front, and while on the Western Front, there were accounts of that he was brave, that he wasn't scared, despite being put into that position. And I think that's something that I've always, kept in my mind, right? That this was a brave man, with a man of empire, whatever his reasons were, as you explained. But there was something in him that was bold, right? There was a man of action.
Churchill was brave beyond the norm. And that's evident right from his very first days on the Northwest frontier as a second lieutenant in a cavalry regiment, where he's charging around the place and he's mentioned in dispatches. His commanding general writes to his mother that he if he carries on at this rate, he'll get a Distinguished Service Order, a DSO, which is, a very high medal for bravery. It doesn't happen because he then leaves and eventually goes into politics. But in 1900, he's recommended for a Victoria Cross, which a lot of people forget. So he's always at the forefront of danger. The first time he comes under fire is on his 21st birthday, when he goes to visit the Spanish-American War in Cuba. And he goes right up to the front, and he comes under fire, and a bullet clips right past him and wounds a horse that's just behind him. And he finds he's not in the least bit afraid of shot and shell, and he finds it exhilarating. And the last time he comes under fire is in 1945, when he witnesses the Rhine crossing with General Montgomery and his 21st Army Group. And then he gets one of the American generals, Bill Simpson, who's commanding one of the American armies, to take him across a mangled, destroyed German railroad bridge across the River Rhine. And they get to the far side and they poke around. And then they come under sniper fire and shell fire. And the American says, listen, Prime Minister, we've got to go. And Winston Churchill hugs a bit of the bridge and looks at him. And the British Chief of the General Staff, Brooke, who later becomes Lord Alan Brooke, says, Churchill looked at the American as though a nanny was calling him away from his sandcastles on the beach and wanted to stay, but eventually was persuaded to leave. It then became apparent that the whole point of Churchill witnessing the crossing of the Rhine was so that he could come under hostile fire for the last time in his life, aged nearly 70.
What an incredible thing. While we're touching on some of these now famous names like Sir Alan Brooke, he had met and had to deal with some of these very strong personalities, larger than life personalities. And as you've mentioned, he was up to the task. This was maybe one of the biggest personalities of the 20th century. So could we perhaps ask for a line or two just on how Churchill and Montgomery met, and then also maybe something on Sir Alan Brooke, and then lastly, if you could, something on Roosevelt?
Churchill and Montgomery met in the First World War, although neither were aware of the other and their future importance, obviously. But in 1918, before the surrender, the British 47th London Division paraded through the French town of Lille, which had just been captured. And its divisional chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Montgomery, was standing by the saluting podium when Winston Churchill, who was then Minister for War in charge of the army, turned up to take the salute. And there's a wonderful photograph of the two of them, unknown to each other, standing within inches of each other, unaware, that each will be hugely influential in the other's career. But they first met in knowing each other in 1940 during the invasion scare. So Montgomery had evacuated his division from France quite well, had taken over a corps in the prime invasion area of southeast England. Churchill had come to visit and had asked Montgomery to dinner. They sat down to discuss invasion matters. And Churchill said, General Montgomery, you're not drinking, then you're not smoking. And Montgomery said, well, I don't drink and I don't smoke and I'm 100% fit. And Churchill immediately retorted, well, I smoke several cigars every day and I drink enormous quantities of alcohol each day and I'm 200% fit. You've got to love the man who comes back like that. But Churchill and Roosevelt was equally interesting. They first met, actually, again, as cabinet ministers, so not as premiers, in 1918 at a dinner. And as Roosevelt later recorded, Churchill was incredibly rude to me. He was a stinker. And I've never been so insulted by someone in public life as by Churchill then. So they were a bit wary of one another, even into 1940. And what really bonded them was less meeting on ships at the beginning of 1941 when America was still neutral. But it was when America found itself at war immediately after Pearl Harbor, And Churchill sort of invited himself to the White House. And before Roosevelt could do anything, he was on a ship across the Atlantic, came to the White House, stayed or arrived on the 22nd December 1941, and he stayed for nearly a month. And Roosevelt couldn't really sort of say, go and find yourself a hotel. So Churchill moved in. He took the whole of the second floor of the White House, took one of Roosevelt's favorite rooms and turned it into a map room, brought all his staff. There were maps on the walls. There were staff running around. The White House had to change its rhythm to adapt to Churchill's demands for particular breakfasts, lunch at certain times, a 2-hour strict nap in the afternoon from 2 to 4 o'clock, dinner late into the evening. Eleanor Roosevelt was furious because her husband was quite frail and in a wheelchair, and yet Churchill would keep him up every night over cocktails and long, long dinners when they refought wars and planned for the future. Churchill didn't leave until mid-January 1942. And in the annals of the White House, they thought that, the Brits had come back and reinvaded because it had become a completely sort of British environment full of staff, but totally dominated by Churchill because he was a healthier, more active man than the president. Though, everyone got on extremely well. But that's really where they sort of cemented their relationship.
That really shows how much Churchill could dominate a room, not just in war councils, but even in the White House on the other side of the Atlantic. But when it came to Normandy, it feels like that dominance turned into the weight of responsibility. And the night before D-Day, as you write in your book, he dined alone with Clemmy and confided. Do you realize that by the time you wake up in the morning, 20,000 men may have been killed? So my question is, how did his past experiences, particularly Gallipoli, shape his thinking in the lead up to Normandy?
And that was inspired by the Gallipoli operation of 1915, which Churchill was behind. He drove it through the cabinet. Now, I'm of the view that the Gallipoli operation was the right solution in the First World War, but poorly implemented and arrived at the wrong time. So there's nothing wrong with it in theory in terms of transferring the military effort from the Western Front to somewhere else as a way of collapsing the Turkish efforts and also aiding the Russians and gaining access to the Black Sea, amongst other things. And if you go walk the terrain now, you can see why the British failed. It wasn't because the Turks were clever. It was because our own commanders were too weak and lacked initiative to push ahead when they had the opportunity. But somehow all of this ended up on Churchill's shoulders, and he was very much blamed, partly by the Conservative government, who were very anti-Churchill at the time because he had left their party and become a liberal, and they didn't trust him. But also a lot of senior establishment figures wanted someone to blame for the Gallipoli disaster as they saw it, and Churchill was the easy, low-hanging fruit, as we might say. And so when you've got a major operation, again, an amphibious operation, the largest really since Gallipoli, that's looming in 1944 in Normandy, Churchill's own anxieties came very much to the fore. Now, we've got to look at that in terms of the other major amphibious operations of the Second World War. Torch in November 1942 against French North Africa, fought by the Americans and the Brits, and then the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, which is technically actually larger than the first day of Normandy because more troops are landed over more beaches. But it's still a major, major undertaking, and that involves British, American, and Canadian troops, which is what's repeated on D-Day. So the success of D-Day is because these other two big operations have happened, and we've gained knowledge and experience and understood just how many troops need to be involved and the ratio of forces. So the Americans were so gung-ho they wanted to do D-Day, the invasion of France in 1942. And part of the British rationale is we're not ready. The Germans are formidable foes. You don't understand what you're dealing with. It's like trying to attack an ant's nest and finding out they're hornets, and you're just not prepared for this enormous undertaking in terms of combat experience, in terms of manpower, in terms of the vast array of forces and specialized equipment you'll need on land, in the sea, and in the air. And he was, absolutely right. So partly there was, yes, an inclination to shy away from something that had gone wrong for him in the First World War, although, as I say, it wasn't his fault. But the Americans saw this partly as trying to avoid doing D-Day. And certainly there's a school of history which says he was reluctant. But I don't think it was that. He managed to delay the implementation of D-Day, and that's largely down to him and no one else, until it was bound to be successful. And that's what the story of the 6th of June 1944 is all about. So, yes, we know we land 156,000 people on a hostile shore, and there's 12,000 aircraft in support and 6,000 ships. But actually, if you look at what's going on in the United Kingdom at the same moment, there's another 1 million men stationed in the United Kingdom ready to cross the Channel with all the shipping that implies. There's all the supplies that they will need. And by the end of August 1944, there will be 1 million men in Europe. And that wouldn't have been possible in 1943 or 1942. And Churchill knows that. I don't think the Americans or the Canadians or even some Brits had twigged that early on. And what Churchill realizes is that even huge, mighty America isn't strong enough to do D-Day on its own. The Second World War was fought and won in the final analysis because of a coalition. And in that, you've got to treat each other as equal partners, even though America has completely outstrips Great Britain in terms of numbers, although not necessarily the British Empire. But you need America's industrial might to win it. But you also have to fight it as equals. And that's why the Churchill-Roosevelt friendship was so important. But because it's delayed for 2 years, that is perceived as a Churchillian weakness. I actually think it's a strength. Had we tried to land in Normandy in 1943, it would have failed. Had we tried even earlier, we'd have had another Dieppe raid that would have been absolutely disastrous. So Churchill's perceived reluctance or delays are actually a strength. That's one of his war-winning assets. He understood history in a way most generals and other politicians of his era didn't, because he's been writing about it. He wrote biographies of the first Duke of Marlborough, about his father, and he had a deep, deep knowledge of history, and particularly military history, and understood just how important these factors were.
No, I think that's a very interesting approach to it, Peter, and it definitely has its merit. And, in saying that, it's often spoken about that Churchill got many things wrong. And even in that, he found a way to put it in a humorous way in saying, I have frequently been made to eat my words. I have always found them to be a most nourishing diet. But even so, jokes aside and all that, he was also right about many of the big things. And he was certainly right about Hitler. And then his leadership was also the right thing at the right time. And without, trying to invoke counterfactuals into this, but do you think that's a fair take on it, that he had gotten these important things right and was the right man for the job?
Well, of course, at the time, he was seen as the wrong man for the job. He was very unpopular in the 1930s because he refused to see that, for example, Indian independence was inevitable. He refused to accept that appeasement was the right policy with Hitler, when the vast majority of the establishment in the United Kingdom and most politicians thought that was the way to go, and that Neville Chamberlain was a great hero. So the country didn't come round to Winston Churchill until after he had become prime minister, and were very suspicious of him when he became prime minister. His personal private secretary, who was a wonderful man called Jock Colville, who wrote The Fringes of Power, his Downing Street diaries, had been private secretary to Chamberlain and then to Churchill. And he didn't like Churchill at all, but he grew to love him and to be his sort of most ardent defender. And the king was exactly the same. Churchill, of course, one of his other mistakes, apart from never quite coming to terms with losing India as a crown possession, one of his other mistakes was that he initially backed Edward VIII in the abdication crisis because he loved monarchs and he didn't like change. And he was a conservative, not only with a large C, but a small c. And that's one of the reasons why he hated communism so much. I mean, he was a real politician in that, he would make bargains with the devil, i.e. Stalin, for the short-term aim of winning the Second World War. But he loved monarchies, and he didn't like the idea of Edward VIII abdicating. And so he came out in favor of him. And when Edward eventually abdicated, now to me, he's a traitor king. He's a absolute rotter and a scoundrel of the First Order. I can find nothing good to say about Edward VIII, later Duke of Windsor. And even Churchill later had to acknowledge he had got that one wrong. Although his wife, and I mean, let's talk about Churchill's wife here, because she gets underplayed. And there's a very good book by Sonia Purnell about Churchill's wife and the influence she has on him, because, she does correct her husband when she feels it necessary. And as you say, he's got a very strong character that so many other people can't stand up to. But yeah, going back to the abdication crisis, he gets that wrong. That means that when he becomes prime minister in 1940, Edward's younger brother, George VI, is incredibly suspicious of this politician who's got a checkered record, who's quite old to do the job of prime minister, and who was much better chums with his older brother than he was with the now monarch. And George VI thought this would all end in tears, as did a lot of the British political establishment, as did Neville Chamberlain, as did Lord Halifax, who was the other runner for office in May 1940. Churchill wasn't forecast to last. And of course, he then rallied the nation. He delivered his marvelous speeches. And to anticipate, I think, one of your future questions, he does bend history into the way that he sees and likes it and wants it to be interpreted. And to a certain extent, because he's written so many books and his legacy was so strong immediately in his lifetime and certainly after his death, and still lasts to this day, that's the version of the Second World War that we have.
You've talked about how Churchill deliberately trained himself for leadership, and that spans from his self-education in India all the way to how he documented his entire life. Do you think his personal background, like his aristocratic roots, his early military years, and the time he spent in the First World War helped shape him as a leader, or was he really just adapting as he went, in your opinion?
Certainly my view, and that of Andrew Roberts, whose wonderful biography, Walking with Destiny, is a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about Churchill. I think right from the word go, Churchill is absolutely convinced that he's destined for the highest echelons of leadership and power, and part of his is to train himself for that. So when he's in India as a young officer, when most people would be galloping around, playing polo, he does a bit of that, but drinking and horsing around, Churchill spends his time in his villa, self-educating himself because he never goes to university, and reading philosophy, politics, history, and really coming up with a sort of mini university education that he would have otherwise spent 3 years having. So, had he not gone into the army and had he gone to Oxford or Cambridge, he'd have certainly been a sort of exhibitioner or a scholar and come out with the first. I've got no doubt there's a very, very active and intelligent brain there. But because he's got this sense of destiny, he is training himself all the time. He sees himself inevitably as going into politics. And then we've got to talk about the Churchill Archive at Cambridge, which is a must for anyone to go and visit. Churchill, when he writes his biography of his father and his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, realizes that finding archival materials when you're writing about people is incredibly difficult. So right from the word go, Churchill saved absolutely everything in his life that had his name on it, or the name of Chartwell, his house, or any of the other places that associated with him. And all that was logged and stored in what became the Churchill Archive Centre at Cambridge. So there is a huge archive associated with one man, and I don't think anyone has archived their life in the same way before or since. That's why there's an 8-volume biography of Churchill that was written by 3 authors during their various lifetimes collectively, supplemented by, I think it's 23 volumes of supplementary notes, letters, diary, extracts. And the whole lot comes to 4 or 5 yards if you put them on a bookshelf. There's no other figure in the English-speaking world who's had so many biographies written about them or so many million words penned. And that's because he had this sense of destiny. He kept this archive. And so, going back full circle to your question, every aspect of his life, I think, is training self-consciously for the great offices of state. And you see that with some of the phrases that come out in his great wartime speeches. Some of them, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. He's used that months earlier when he's talking about something else with Sir Alan Brooke, who's then a general and not chief of the Imperial General Staff. He's a great recycler. And what's really impressive is how many articles he can recycle from each other. So an article becomes a speech and then it becomes a book. So his brain is active every single day. And, he has these teams of secretaries that he's dictating to all along. Even when he's having a bath, there's a secretary outside the bathroom door with a shorthand notebook, taking down his thoughts as they occur to him. And that's the way his life works. He never really switches off, which is why he needs this 2-hour nap from 2 till 4. And I have to say, if you live that close to Churchill, you suddenly realize the wisdom of these things. So I have a power nap in the afternoon after lunch, and it just allows you to really crack on and make the most of an evening's work as well.
It is incredible how much Churchill documented and preserved his own history, right down to these tiny, tiny details like laundry receipts and all of that. But he also famously said that history would be kind to him because he intended to write it. Do you think he bent the truth in his own accounts of the war?
He totally bent the truth. David Reynolds has written a very good book about Churchill and his book, The Second World War, and how he wrote it. And when you start to go through it in enormous detail, as I did for my book on the D-Day landings and subsequently the defeat of Germany in 1945, you realize that, the Second World War is a sort of magisterial undertaking, but each chapter is written by a team of experts, directed by Churchill, who then polishes the final result. So by the 1940s, 1950s, Churchill is directing other people to do the legwork, and he then polishes the output. And there are a lot of notes, telegrams, official documents quoted in each to justify his decisions and what happened in the war. But some of those are heavily doctored. He misses out paragraphs and sentences and rejigs others to put his decision-making in a favorable light. I mean, he was a poor decision-maker for the Norway campaign in 1940 when he was First Lord of the Admiralty. He's culpable, although I don't think to blame, for the Bengal famine in the later years of the war. He certainly sent HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse down to Singapore at the beginning of 1942 to their doom in a completely unnecessary gesture because he didn't really understand just how important air power was and how effective it was against battleships. He was still living in the past then. He split his forces in the Mediterranean in the Desert War. And just when we were winning in the Western Desert, just before General Rommel appears, he demands that half that force go to Greece to stop the Germans there with an overwhelming force. He splits that land force in two, with the result that the land force in the desert almost get defeated and the land force that go to Greece and Crete. So he pulls off two defeats from what should have been a good victory. there are plenty of times when he gets it wrong, and because he's such a forceful character and intervenes in a way that a modern politician wouldn't think of doing in terms of overruling his generals, there are some disastrous moments, and they are glossed over or doctored in his history of the Second World War, which shows that you've got to be a diligent historian. You've got to comb the archives. You've got to work out what's going on, because there is a veil of Churchillian rhetoric, and we love him for it. But there's still this aspect to Churchill that colors the truth to the way he would want to be remembered, and we have to be careful about that.
That's a very good way to put it, Peter. And I love your earlier point about, the way he created an archive while living. And I think that's very telling, in terms of his view of, continuities, in terms of the idea that something is forever and that future biographers would come along. And then also what you've just mentioned about him, famously mobilizing and weaponizing the English language, well, for the purposes of war and victory and ultimately for his own. But just as we're coming closer to the end now, are there any famous Churchillian quotes or experiences or anecdotes that we maybe missed out on so far that you think would be very important for our listeners?
We forget that his relationship, which is odd because he was a Chancellor of the Exchequer in charge of the nation's finances, but his own finances were a complete disaster for nearly all his life. And it's a wonder he didn't die earlier of stress, because he's constantly going to bank managers and stockbrokers to try and get them to bail him out of trouble. And he has to borrow money left, right and centre at extortionate interest rates. And it's only after the Second World War, when he can breathe a sigh of relief because he's the saviour of the free world, his finances sort of come into order. And he doesn't pay his bills on time. I mean, you'd think that Churchill is this wonderful example of probity and uprightness. But I found letters in the Churchill archives where his wine merchants and his gunsmiths are demanding payment for bills that they had submitted 3 years earlier. Now, you and I couldn't get away with that, cash on the nail. And in those long lost days, not only did people sort of, put things on account, but Churchill then didn't pay his accounts. And I mentioned armory. The old gunsmiths. He had an armory of 12 weapons, including submachine guns and pistols, never mind shotguns for shooting. You have to wonder what's going on there. This is before the Second World War. So after the war, what happens is he's run out of money. Churchill is drained all the time because of building and rebuilding and adapting and changing Chartwell and adding to the estate, which is gorgeous. And actually, to understand the man, you've got to go and visit the house. Catherine Carter, who's the curator there, has written a wonderful book called Churchill's Citadel, which is all about Chartwell and how important it was to him in the 1930s. But it was only after the Second World War that a group of industrialists, mostly newspaper owners, got together and said, we will buy Chartwell off you. We'll give it to the National Trust. You can have the proceeds from the purchase. And what you will have to do is pay the National Trust an annual rent for the rest of your lives of 350 quid a year, which is still a lot in those days, but nothing like the sort of financial challenges he'd had up to those times. So he and Clemmy could then sort of sit out their retirement there for the next, as it turned out, 25 years. And that sort of took the strain. And that's when a lot of the sort of Churchillian sort of wit and wisdom sparkled. And I think, the thing to think about Churchill is that he's this wonderfully inspiring character. So he sparkles and uses the English language in absolutely wonderful ways, but he induces other people around him to. And, the quality of speeches, of statesmanship, of rhetoric in his day is much higher than it is today. But that's because people are striving to emulate him or to beat him or to match him in the House of Commons and all over the place. And his son, Randolph Churchill, was actually a much better off-the-cuff speaker than even his father. But, he's an alcoholic, he's indulged by his father, and he dies young, and so he sort of fades from the scene. But it's the words I think we know him by, because, of course, in those days, there wasn't television. there are a couple of screen tests of Churchill and television, and mostly him rehearsing speeches to try and get people to vote for him in the 1950 and 1951 general elections. And he keeps forgetting his lines. He can't look at the camera. He's hesitating. I mean, it's Churchill all over and he looks wonderful, but you suddenly realize he's uncomfortable with the TV age, which he calls a tuppenny halfpenny Punch and Judy show. In a time where television, the small screen, influences our lives and certainly those of politicians, and it makes and breaks public figures, Churchill, I think, would have been very vulnerable. He couldn't have avoided using television, and yet he was never comfortable with it. Radio was his medium, and even more so, writing books, neither of which today's generation of public figures are particularly good at. He's an influencer in the old-fashioned sense of the word. He would have been all over Twitter. He would have been absolutely all over social media. And in terms of, cramming thoughts into 280 characters or whatever it is, I mean, he's absolutely your man. I mean, we can easily criticize people like President Trump for sort of relying too much on social media. Goodness me, Winston Churchill, this would have been a gift for him and he would have exploited it. You can imagine him sort of after a heavy air raid or criticizing Churchill through the whole appeasement crisis, or Chamberlain, you have chosen peace, but war is around the corner. All sorts of little phrases like his mind and his writings are made for those tiny little quotes and nuggets. And in that sense, I think, he's incredibly modern at the same time as being very old fashioned. So when he dies in January 1965, I mean, it's, the 60th anniversary of his death this year. And that's my first memory. I was taken to the long queue to walk past his coffin. And my grandfather was a Anglican bishop who sat in the House of Lords. So he officiated at the funeral. And that's something else I remember. But I can remember sort of shuffling past him. So I wasn't really aware of quite who he was, but I do remember this long, cold queue. But when he died, a lot of people sort of summed him up as really the representative of the British Empire, which had already long gone. And he was its last sort of dying relic. So it wasn't just Churchill whose past they were mourning. It was also Britain that had also long gone and he had come to represent. And that, I think, is probably how we, in one way, we look back on him, because he represents a whole era, not just a man, not just winning a war, but it's the whole of, the first half of the 20th century, really, that he represents. You can't write British or world history in the last 100 years without referring to Winston Churchill. And there are very few people who will go down that way. And I mean, more has been written about him than any other British prime minister before or since his lifetime. And I can't see that will be equaled or bettered any time in the future, because his lifespan was so huge. But as I say, that was down to luck. But it was this inquiring mind that put him down all sorts of different avenues of painting and drawing and bricklaying and interior design and garden decoration. And he collected butterflies. And I mean, there wasn't anything that he wasn't obsessed by. He collected roses. He traveled to nearly every country in the world. And that didn't stop the older he got. He got even more and more curious. And he collected these people around him who satisfied this sense of curiosity. He was also a great futurologist. I mean, he would read H.G. Wells and then sort of, in the 1930s, ask people, is there any possibility of time travel, or can we use lasers in war? He foresaw the atom bomb. Perhaps one day, we will be able to split the atom and use its awesome power. And this is long before most people had heard of these concepts. So that's that sort of interesting mind at work. And it's a yardstick for modern politicians. If you don't have that curiosity, you don't have that wider sense of the world and geopolitics, then you're never going to be able to step into the shoes of a statesman. I mean, William Hague, I think, has it. Wasn't a very good leader of the party, but he's since grown into this figure of gravitas, and John Major too, because they've travelled widely and both have got this sense of history, and they've written about figures in the past as well, just like Churchill. And I think there's such an essential ingredient.
And I think his influence, as you said, is unprecedented. A lot of people today still try to mimic his leadership or even surpass it. And that makes me think about the future. Since you write a lot about Ukraine, I wanted to ask, many have called Zelensky a modern Churchill. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
Yes, I do. And it struck me straight away. And I don't think it was Zelensky doing it self-consciously. Every now and again, history throws up people who are influential far beyond the borders of their own country, where their natural qualities of bravery and leadership come to the fore. And Zelensky could have easily said, thank you very much, I'll escape and run my country from exile, from elsewhere in Europe or from the United States. But he stayed, and he famously said, I don't need a plane ride, I need ammunition. And I mean, he wasn't very popular at the beginning of the invasion in February 2022, but he suddenly acquired this mantle and godlike status in his own country. And when President Trump says that, Zelensky is incredibly unpopular and has a support in the polls of something like 6%, and I've got 60%, he's completely misreading the facts, possibly willfully, but also I think because he hasn't been to Ukraine, he just doesn't understand. Zelensky's in the 70s in terms of poll ratings and hasn't slipped from there at all. And, that's what, his particular brand of leadership has given him. And although he hasn't written about history, Zelensky is an actor and a very television savvy and friendly. I mean, a lot of his television, ironically, has been done in Moscow. But he understands the medium backwards much better than nearly all politicians right across Europe. And that's why he's come to the fore. He's extremely comfortable with the medium. He's got this personal courage and magnetism. So he's a counterpart to Churchill. He's not the same. He's not a mimic. He's not copying. But every generation, I think, throws up one or two individuals who shine like that. And history will be kind to them in the history books. Not necessarily because, they're going to write their own story, just because they are natural leaders and they move and shake in a positive way and inspire others. That's what leadership is all about. It's not just commanding or directing. It's inspiring other people. And that's what Churchill did. And I think that's what, beyond doubt, that's what Zelensky is doing at the moment. And you look at a lot of other leaders across the world at the moment. They're in their position. They fought to get there. But do they inspire? Probably not. Will history remember them? Almost certainly not, because there are very few names that, history can cope with. But Zelensky is one. I'm sure he will go down as one of those figures. And if you want shorthand for the first half of the 21st century, it will be Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, just as it was for the first half of the 20th century, Winston Churchill of Great Britain.
Support the mission, one beer at a time. Head to undergroundstrategy.com/support and we'll raise a glass in your honor. Now, let's get back to it.
It's an interesting example that you used over there, Peter. And I think what's interesting for me is that, you had mentioned that, being present on the, on the front lines, or being, having that bravery. I think that goes a long way, that being present. Just to build on that a little bit is that part that you mentioned about the acting. I think that's come out, whenever he's gone to different countries. And I know when he was in the UK, it's just like he shapes this message for every audience, right? When he spoke in the House of Commons and he says, in this country, the king is a pilot. But in my country, in Ukraine, every pilot is a king. So he has these witty little, just little messages that he throws out, and he just hits it every single time. I can't help but agree. And I'll just add one more point, before I bring you in for comments. We were in Sofia last year, and with another colleague, who was actually the deputy minister for social policy and digital transformation, doing some work of Ukraine. And we were kind of a bit of banter, and he says, yeah, you shouldn't make this guy's a comedian. And I said, hey, what do you mean? What are you saying there about? And before I could even make the joke, he says, hey, I'm going to stop you right there, because our President Zelensky, he was a comedian, he was an actor, but don't forget, he also ran a production company. And he says, and that's why this guy has this amazing endurance, that he is like a rock star. They can be in this stage today, that stage tomorrow. He can go from place to place to place. And I think that's, something that we're still getting to know the depths of this man, who, as you mentioned, has already, established himself in the history.
Well, I think the whole point about public office and being a public figure is everybody comes to it with a hinterland. Some people arrive by accident. Some people think they've got a sense of destiny and spend all their life trying to get there. So it's not necessarily a given that you're going to assume that sort of role. But everyone who arrives at the top has come through different avenues. And that avenue, whatever it is going to give you advantages, whether it's familiarity with television, whether it's familiarity with the military and leadership, whether it's understanding business and finance, whether it's being a lawyer and being very good at argument and words. I mean, there are lots of different backgrounds. So, Zelensky comes from one. Churchill, that's why some people dismissed him because he didn't have a profession behind him. He hadn't been to university, so he had to fight much, much harder. I mean, in the United Kingdom, you're not just usually a politician on your own. You come from a group of friends or a profession where there are lots of lawyers, so they all help each other, or lots of land agents, or lots of solicitors, or you come from a region where everybody knows each other, or a family like the Salisbury family who've provided generations of politicians. Churchill didn't really have any of that. His father had been Chancellor of the Exchequer and a brilliant politician, but he was long dead by the time Churchill rose to power, and he didn't even see him into Parliament. So Churchill's very much on his own, and he doesn't have any of these support groups. So he is very much his own man. And, the person who supports him most is his wife, Clementine Churchill, that everybody forgets. His family say, we understand that Churchill is often away fighting wars or elections. We grew up to understand that it was Winston first and second and third. And, Winston and Clemmy, had a very strong relationship with each other, but their 4 surviving children clocked up 8 marriages between them. And, he dominated their lives. They didn't really have the freedom to sort of conduct their own life and find their own way. There was always, this hugely dominating figure, that wasn't malicious, but he was just so powerful that he completely overshadowed, almost unintentionally, his children, but also everyone around him, but also every other politician, and indeed a whole generation. And I think, that's what's important. But within Churchill, within his deeper sense, he has, his own hinterland is uncertain. He's had to fight against the odds a lot of the time. He's made a lot of wrong decisions. He's changed political parties twice. So he has to fight all the time to get to where he is. And when we look back, we just think of this smooth, completely uncontested rise to the top and brilliance and this legacy that he's left us. And so much of that is chance and accident and determination. I mean, he really is his favorite phrase is keep buggering on, KBO. Although it was politely changed to his female staff as keep battling on. But he had this deep, deep well of determination. A lot of other people just don't have. You reach a point where you give up. And in that sense, I think he's also a tremendous inspiration for people. When he went to Harrow School in 1940 to deliver a speech, and, he'd had a checkered relationship with his old boarding school. He ended up his speech in 1940 by saying, never, 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 never give up. And a lot of his speech came back to that and the school picked it up and carried on chanting it. And that's what that's what his life was all about. And the trouble is, if you go down a wrong avenue, and we've explored some of the wrong avenues he did go down, it's very difficult to sort of reverse out of them. But he has that sticking power that people appreciated in 1940 that they needed when the odds seemed very much against winning. And that's why, he's an actor in terms of his dress. He uses props. He loves, his bow ties and his hats and his silver walking canes, and he's never seen without them. But they are essentially props, and the cigar and the V for Victory sign. And they're far more important in a pre-television age. And he's quite self-aware of that, and he uses them. So those don't happen by accident. He acquires them, he exploits them, the nation responds, and that's another way that we know him. The front of my book on Winston Churchill is simply a picture of a Homburg hat and a smoking cigar. And you wouldn't need the words Winston Churchill on the front cover to understand who the book is about. And in today's world, of influencers and public figures, you don't have that because you expect to see them on television, and they wouldn't dominate just using those kind of tricks that Churchill used. So, again, it's a reflection of the man. And perhaps I've just written a piece about his boiler suit that he wore, and, the way it might have been identified as being disrespectful to the Americans or anyone, in fact, that he visited. But he invented it. It's basically a boiler suit with a zip front that you could quickly fling over your pajamas in time of an air raid, and he called it a siren suit. But he took to wearing it so often. If you look at the Yalta Conference, if you look at the summits with Roosevelt in 1943, his meetings with Montgomery or General Eisenhower, he's wearing it all the time. For the war years, he pretty much gives up wearing a suit and bow tie, except for a few very formal occasions, and is in this incredibly informal attire. And that removes any class distinction of the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough. It removes any sense of elitism of him being a prime minister or an MP or a member of the establishment. And it communicates straight to every working man who also has a blue boiler suit that here is an individual ready to roll up his sleeves and win the war through sheer guts and determination. So, this is a time when, clothing matters. Today's world is one of hoodies and logos and T-shirts, and I'm never sort of quite comfortable with that. But Churchill had his own version of that, and he understood how powerful it was. And you mentioned messaging. All his speeches are messages to people. When he says, "Give us the tools and we will finish the job," that's directed to America. If you dissect his speeches, so many of them are communicating to different sectors of British society or countries around the world, particularly the United States. And he absolutely understands messaging. And one of my military backgrounds, part of my hinterland is military media operations. So I was doing the sort of military media messaging from NATO to other countries around the world. And, you divide your listeners into different categories: friendly people, the people back home, your opponents, neutrals around the world. And that's what Churchill was doing. And that's how he composed his speeches. So the more you look at him, the more interesting it is that he's approaching media operations in a very modern way.
Peter, I couldn't agree more. And I really hope some of our modern leaders could take a page from that playbook and rethink how they approach media and messaging. But of course, it's a very different landscape today to navigate. Thank you so much for lending your time to us. I know we have only scratched the surface of Churchill's story, and there is so much more to explore. It's been a fantastic discussion, and we would love to have you back in the future to continue it.
I've enjoyed it hugely, and thank you for the honor of inviting me on. And as you say, more in the future.
Thank you so much, Peter. I really enjoyed that. That was just tremendous.
And with that, folks, we wrap up for this week. Thank you to everyone who has been tuning in, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.